So just to get us started, I mean, I'm a little bit familiar with some of your work. I think I told you, but I saw you in Red Velvet back several years ago at Chicago Shakespeare Theater, and have sort of followed you ever since because I was so impressed with your performance. So I'm familiar with some of your theater and film work, but I'm wondering, I guess, how you got your start in acting, kind of what drew you to it in the first place, and then what you see as your purpose behind what you do as an actor.
hmm Well, I'm Canadian, so I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, and my earliest influences were largely comic books. So the era that we live in now, with all of the Marvel films and the DC franchise, is like gravy for me because I know all of those stories straight to my core. I used to be a comic book artist as well too, so it was something I took very seriously. And what I loved about it, the mythology behind it. Um, when I started getting into literature, one of the first things I stumbled upon were the Greek and Norse myths. My parents got me a Bullfinch's mythology, and I started to see the similarities between the comics I was reading and Greek and Norse mythology. And so I began to love myths as well too. And then when I was in school and we started studying Shakespeare, I quickly started to recognize, wow, a lot of the metaphors and the symbolism that's being used come out of Greek mythology. And and so I understood the metaphors that were being used, and I had a connection, sort of an innate connection to the language. So for me, very quickly in terms of acting, I stumbled straight into Shakespeare, and I connect that in the funniest of ways all the way back to comic books. In fact, as a transition from my parents were said, we love the fact that you love comic books, but we would love to see you, explore literature. And before giving me the Bullfinch's mythology, the sort of a transition step was they found at a flea market these classic comics, which were comics that were done in the 50s and the 60s, but were based off of like the Three Musketeers and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and one of them was Julius Caesar. So I even had pictures in my head of what the story looked like from that comic book that I had as a kid. So I had an and an easy natural feel for language and mythology and symbolism that like none of my cohorts in school had. So when we had to pass the book around, or not pass the book around, but sort of like trade off reading passages from Shakespeare and everyone stumbling over it and just hating it, I was just like relishing it, going, when can I get on a stage,
Mm.
And the thing that I love about acting, I mean, we're doing it constantly in our daily lives. We're manifesting this idea of who we are and creating our vision of the world around us based off of our thoughts and our intentions. And and acting just seems to, I mean, it's a perfect metaphor and just a wonderful way of exploring those tools, because I found that through acting I get the opportunity to learn more about the human condition and more about myself
Mm.
through doing the detective work of trying to understand, why would a person do this, what would be the needed motivation to get me from this step to that step. And if it's outside of the realm of what I'm comfortable thinking, then I really have to do some work to try to explore. Well, I mean, what would a person be like? What would be necessary in order to be able to think in a way that could allow that to happen? So I love the detective work. I feel through acting, I just really get to understand more of who we are, and and also act as a proxy for the audience, so that audience members who don't have necessarily the confidence to do that in their own lives can explore those ideas, can have that experience themselves through me, through watching me go through it. So I think there's you know a wonderful role that we have as actors to society in terms of what we provide for audiences, is the opportunity to reflect on themselves and their own condition and step outside of themselves in a safe way.
Mm.
So yeah, that's what draws me to it, and what I ultimately I feel my purpose in it is.
So it's interesting to me because it sounds like Shakespeare then actually was part of your early interest in acting, right? We went from comic books to mythology to Shakespeare, and your desire to
Mhm.
get that onto the stage. So that's really interesting that Shakespeare is so tied to your kind of early interest in acting. But so as you then did begin to act, and I know you've done some Shakespeare and some not Shakespeare. So just out of the whole canon of your work, what do you think are some of the most meaningful roles that you've played, and why do you think those roles are important to you?
I would say, funny enough that you mentioned Red Velvet as being the first time that you saw me.
Yeah.
I think that for me was one of the most amazing opportunities I've been given as an actor. For so many reasons. It's such a challenging role. Number one, I mean, you're playing a man at the height of his career, you know, and then also at the blossoming really of his career, and at the very end of his life. And there's, you know, a span of 30 years sort of in between. And so there's that challenge alone. But for me, it was, you know, I had never heard of Ira Aldridge. I'd heard his name, but I didn't know about him. And he certainly wasn't brought up in any of my theater school studies. And so it was only when I got the role and started to do the research that I came upon his very extensive documented history. And it blew me away. It made me really feel like, what could my life be as an actor if I already knew that ground had been broken to such an incredible extent before me? If I didn't feel like I was doing something where I was kind of like one of the first people who were doing it. There weren't a lot of other Black actors doing Shakespeare, certainly in my community growing up. So I always felt like an anomaly. And so there was a lot of sort of subtle psychological work that I had to do to keep myself in a space where I could do it and feel that I had a right to do it. And that's pretty much the experience of any Black actor doing classical work is. I mean, that's a big challenge. But to know that, I mean, not only did he play Othello, the first Black actor to play Othello on the London Covent Garden stage, but he also played Shylock. He played Macbeth. He played all of these different roles, and he did it well. So that blew my mind. The fact that I didn't know that was shocking, and the gift of being able to be in that skin for that period of time gave me so much. So it's great to play roles where you feel like you're giving a contribution. So the next generation of artists or audience members who are out there watching the play, as challenging as a play as it is to see, are getting a direct experience of an imagining of history that's theirs now, that they have it with them, that they don't have to, you know, they can go through life kind of knowing, especially if you're an artist of color, someone did this before me, and they did it to great excellence. So that was really cool. Another role was the character's called Jay Jackson, and he's a boxer in a play called The Royale, written by Marco Ramirez. And it's loosely based on the Jack Johnson story. And Jack Johnson was the first African-American boxer to become the world heavyweight champion. He got that title, I believe, in 1908, but then he had to fight to retain it in 1910, which they called the fight of the century. And he won that fight as well too. And that was another wonderful experience, because I didn't know much about Jack Johnson. And there's another guy who was breaking barriers in history, but has sort of been kind of buried a little bit in the past, and he's only now kind of starting to get his comeuppance again. And it was a great physical role because there was a stylized form of boxing that I needed to learn in order to be able to perform it. The language was very poetic and rhythmic, and very much using language to create the sensation of being inside the head of a boxer during a match, which was brilliant. And then through all of that, dealing with his wrestling with what is my responsibility to my community because I'm Black, but also what's my responsibility to myself and my own hopes and my own dreams, because I just am who I am, you know, and the conflict of those, which I found fascinating.
Right.
So that was a great role to play too.
I'm glad that Red Velvet was such a great experience for you too. And it sounds like both of these roles that you've mentioned sort of, I don't know, to me, it sounds like they point to almost like that you're gaining something as well, as much as you're giving, right? In performing these roles, you're gaining some sort of inspiration from the characters. And I found it interesting that both of the characters that you mentioned have, you know, their Black identity is quite central then to to their conflict, right?
Mhm.
So I think you're touching on this a little bit, but I wonder if you can expand on kind of what it means to you to be a Black actor and to play Black characters, and what you see as valuable or important for you in that.
Yeah, and it's a challenging question, because on one level, I'm just an actor. I see myself as playing roles and wanting to challenge myself as any other actor. Why the need for Black actor?
Mm.
But I'm also Black, and there are challenges inherently that come with that. And there is, like, I think about growing up, there were a certain set of images that I received from the films and the music, that I saw, sort of what was culturally accepted as this is Black identity. And it had a lot of positive stuff to it and a lot of negative stuff to it. And it was a limited vision of what it means to be Black. And thankfully, as time has evolved and as things are continuing to open up, we're beginning to see far more diversity, within the Black community, and realize that we all have a shared common understanding, and certainly the American identity and Canadian to an extent. But we're all different within that. We all have different histories, different upbringings, different belief systems, different. And so I feel as a Black actor, I have the opportunity to add to that by not playing into the same kind of tropes that I've seen in the past, but by offering a different light based off of what my experience has been.
Yeah.
So and also the roles that have been Black specifically roles that have really interested me have been ones where I go, wow, this is uncovering something that I didn't know was there, and that when I talked to a lot of people around me, they didn't know was there. And so there's a lot of hidden gems out there that have yet to be uncovered. And so I feel that's an opportunity as an actor to just keep an eye out for those, and to be a part of that. Because for me, I would just, I feel there's really is something, there's such an advantage that a person has when they know the shoulders that they stand on, when they know where they're coming from, and you sort of get that leg up. And I think right now, certainly within the Black community, we need as much of that as possible, because so much of that history has been hidden from us, or not allowed to be told, or buried. And so we don't know where the greatness that we come from in its full extent. So I feel I have those opportunities being a Black actor to do that. But then in and outside of that, I don't want to limit myself. I feel in the end it's also about transcending that, because being an actor is stepping outside of yourself as well too. So yeah.
That really leads well into my next question, I think, which is just kind of what kind of negative situations or circumstances have you experienced as a Black actor? I feel like you've touched on that a little bit and said that there's been progress made from when you were younger. But I'm wondering if you can think of any situations or circumstances that you viewed as negative, and if you were able to overcome those in some way, how, or what do you wish that others maybe would have done differently in those situations?
Yeah. For me, directly, maybe the most direct experience that I've had was when I was in theater school, and we were in our second year and performing Shaw, and we were doing a production of Major Barbara, and I wanted to audition for the role of Undershaft, Father Undershaft, and no other actor wanted that role. And our director, I remember telling me, well, that would be too much of a challenge for you. I mean, you would have to go against your entire cultural identity, and we need to find a role that's more appropriate for you. And so the role I ended up getting was the butler, and a street urchin, who's a great character in it. And both of them, there was no bad character in Shaw, but it was interesting. They were characters that you could easily justify me as playing. And so when I had an interview with the board at the end of the year, they sort of interviewed all of the students and just wanted to talk about, because we were about to go into our third year, and they wanted to know, what we foresaw for ourselves, what challenges, what are, and I said, I've been largely happy with everything I've been receiving and the training and all of that, but I just noticed that I've never played a lover, I've never played the hero, I'm never a central family member. I'm always playing roles where I'm sort of relegated to the side in a way that could be justifiable. And ultimately, as long as I have a good story and a good, I don't care. But on the same token, I want to know what it feels like to be the hero, what it feels like to be a part of the family. And this shocked the board. This was something that they didn't realize was it had factored in their perception. They, you know, when they looked at it, they're like, wow, yeah, wow. So they really worked in my final year to change that. But I know systemically that's been an issue over many theater schools and many theater companies that really haven't known how to deal, especially when doing the classics, with race.
Yeah.
You know? And so that was a direct experience that happened. And then not too long ago, and I won't mention like companies or anything like that, but I do remember doing a production, and this was more recent, and there were a handful of Black actors in the company, as often is, and it was a classical piece, and I would say that we failed to have a conversation in the rehearsal hall about how race factored into the world that we were creating, and neither of us as actors really communicated with each other until after the fact, as the production went up, and then we all started to get to know each other, relax a little bit, and then I started to realize that other people were feeling the same way, and I guess it was sort of you realize that we've sort of been trained to just sort of fall into place and trained to sort of figure it out for yourself, and because it wasn't an overt thing, it was like just one of those subtle little things. The subtle little thing of not even having the conversation leaves all of these open ends that you as the actor are left to carry. What does race mean in this context of our relationship that I'm in? If I'm not with another actor who's Black, what does that mean in the context of the society that we live in? What does that mean in the context of the world that we're building? And even just answering those questions puts it in a context that makes it more playable, and even by that definition makes it more inclusive. Because the trade-off of that is it's not just the experience of the actor in the role, it's the experience of the audience coming to see the play. And I remember watching a play where I saw a line delivered by an actor who I knew was of mixed race. And she had a line, it was like one of those things where they were at like a party, sort of a soiree. And it was like one of those, the Cask of Monte Cristo, or like one of those kind of swashbuckling tales. And everyone panics at this party because a big event happens. And she says, oh my God, the slaves or the Negroes or the something are attacking, you know? And it was delivered in a way where, you know, and I was sitting with another actor who was Black, and it just, the moment she said it, it was like someone reached out and slapped us across the face. Like I was just stunned. And I was stunned, not because she said that, but because it was said in a way that there was no like awareness behind it, like as if she hadn't really thought about what she was saying, or the director had thought about the implications of what she was saying, that there was no story behind it. It was just sort of said. Mm-hmm. And largely for the audience who was largely white, probably pass over them and they didn't think about it. But for audience members who were of color, like it just hit you like a gut punch. And you think about all of those productions where those questions aren't taken care of, they're just sort of left hanging like they don't matter. What does it do to that audience? All of a sudden you don't feel like you're included, that this is a world that you're a part of or respected or any care, you know, like you you know, you just hit all of a sudden. And it occurred to me that in this recent production that I had done, to any member of color in the audience, you know, they just might have noticed that, yeah, there were, you know, Black actors in the show. That's great. I mean, you could say technically there's representation, but there was no feel for what that meant in the world. I got no sense of who they were, what you know what I mean? Yeah. And so there becomes a missing piece that definitely certain parts of the audience feel. And you wonder why, you know, a lot of Black people don't like going to classical theater. It's not that they wouldn't enjoy it, but it's like they don't see themselves represented on that stage. And I think there's easy ways where they could be represented by even just having the conversation helps. I think there's many ways, but even just having the conversation of, in the context of our world, what does this mean? And I think recent events that have really sent a shockwave through the industry will certainly help to change that. I feel actors have the opportunity, definitely, of feeling more empowered, because I you know, the onus shouldn't be on you as an actor, but also on the same token, if you don't get your answers, you know, your questions answered, you're left holding the ball, right? You know, so in a way, you should be self-motivated to bring it up if it's not being brought up.
Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with We See You White American Theater? It's sort of a manifesto.
I heard about it. Yes, that passed 2 summers ago, right?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
A very similar thing. Yeah, tell me about it.
I hear you echoing something that is kind of foundational to that manifesto, which is kind of the problem of acceptance of Black bodies without the acceptance of Black culture, and how, you know, putting a Black person on the stage does not mean that you've done your job of representation, right? That, you know,
Right.
Black culture is important, and to kind of, you know, too many productions say we're going to put Black people on our stage or on the screen, but we are going to assume that they will assimilate into what we think of as our normal culture, which is, you know, white culture. And so the problem of that. So I wondered if you were familiar, just because that's a really strong aspect of that manifesto that I hear you echoing, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah, I am familiar with that. Around the same time, a shockwave went through the Canadian theater industry as well, too. And so it's been very reassuring and interesting seeing the response that the Canadian theater community has had and the changes that they are working to implement. And it all remains to, once our theaters open and then we see what the new visions are, it all remains to be seen how things are implemented. But certainly this period of time has, you know, a shutdown of theater. All of the events that came after George Floyd's murder have really brought us face to face with these issues. And it feels like, only time will tell, you know, that we may be starting to finally address it in a meaningful way.
I hope so. I really, really do. If I can pivot us a little bit, I wanted to ask you also if you might comment on your relationship to Shakespeare. I know you talked about how it was kind of an early inspiration towards acting for you, but how do you relate to Shakespeare? Has that changed over time?
For me, my love for Shakespeare is in language, and is in I mean, what I love about Shakespeare is the architecture of language. And so one of the courses that I've begun to teach, and it was really developed from what I learned when I was training at Stratford, is in rhetoric, basically, in using the tools of argument that are so prevalent in Shakespeare's language. His use of ethos, logos, and pathos, and how those pillars and structures are used to convince and sway and woo and win your listener, or the other character, or ultimately your audience. And what I love about that is I mean, that's what's used in messaging towards us every day. When we look at the news, when we go through our Twitter feed, when we, you know, scroll through social media, whether it's in images, whether it's in headlines, whether it's in, like, we're constantly having information thrown at us that's meant to sway our emotions and direct our thought and energy, and it uses different coded styles of language. And so I find understanding Shakespeare, being able to understand the complexity of his thought, gives you more discernment and power over those tools. Certainly, as an actor, it makes other forms of acting easier, because you can start to see the bare skeleton of a thought and kind of go, oh, I see what they're trying to do there, and you can sort of fill it in, you know. Yeah. So, and because we live in the structure in the North American world of the English language, so I feel the more of an understanding that we can have of it, the more discernment we have, and the more enjoyment we can have walking around in that world. The more we can be aware of what might be played on us as well, too. You know. So that's what I've really come to love about Shakespeare is the opportunity to continue to hone those tools, and then to mix how do you play something that's, what I love are the actors who can take this language that needs to be heightened. You can't make it pedestrian, or else it loses the air and it doesn't work. But they can still speak it in a way that sounds completely direct and completely almost natural. That you go, I understand you 100%. You know, there's nothing stagey or removed with how you're communicating with me, even though you're speaking very heightened language. You know, so I think it's a marvelous skill and challenge, and it feels good to speak it, to embody those thoughts, to have them coursing through your body, you know, and spirit.
Yeah, that's something I really admire about Shakespearean actors, their ability to communicate in such a grounded way using, you know, this beautiful heightened language. Feels oxymoronic, so that's really, really impressive. I guess my next question for you is also about Shakespeare and Shakespearean works, and this is something we've been talking a lot about in the class that's working on this database. But do you think that Shakespearean works which potentially marginalize people of color have a place on today's stage or screen?
I think ultimately consideration, like your why. Got to ask, why is this necessary? Why do I want to tell this story? How does this story have benefit to teach, to heal, to better my audience? You know, because I think the missing piece through a lot of this has been not being inclusive of who's coming to watch, who these plays affecting. And there are ways of doing the plays where you can, you know, Shakespeare works on opposites, and so black and white is central, fair and dark, and those can be used in ways that have great meaning, because he's often doing antithesis. So he's saying what seems fair is not necessarily fair, and what seems dark is not necessarily dark. So there's great opportunity for exploration and for deconstructing those ideas if you look for it in the language. And there's other times where it's archaic and it could be cut. It's not useful. It's not really moving anything forward, and it's hard to perform it in a way that just doesn't sound offensive or hurtful. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I think those discussions have to happen in the rehearsal hall, kind of point for point, like, what are we gonna do about this? Is this useful? Is it harmful? Should we get rid of it? Can it be performed in a way that there's meaning, you know, to the highest good? I feel if those discussions continue to happen, these challenging plays can continue to have a space, because I think there's so much good in the place to throw the baby out the bathwater. You know, you miss some great opportunities. So I think there are ways of doing it.
Yeah, I love that answer. That's something that I haven't heard yet in other people who we've been interviewing. This idea that, you know, the story is still valuable, and maybe we don't have to be married to every word of the language. Despite Shakespeare's language being beautiful, we can cut things if maybe they don't serve the overall purpose. And I love what you're talking about with the intentionality behind that time. I think that's something that sometimes is overlooked in rehearsal space. All right, to finish us off, I was wondering if you would maybe share with me your hope for the future of your industry in relation to race. And I also wonder if you might comment on where you see yourself in that future.
Big question. I mean, this is, I suppose in a way, it's a summary of everything that I've been saying. And it's going back to that missing piece. You know, when Othello was first performed, it was never intended for a Black audience. I mean, it was written in England by a white playwright imagining an idea of what his idea of a Moorish general might be. And it was done in blackface. And so the audience members watching it, because they knew it was blackface, in a way it was like a mask, and it allowed them an escape so they could imagine themselves in the role. And it was only when Ira Aldridge stepped in the role and they saw an actual Black man in the role that then their own preconceptions were challenged, and all of a sudden became a very dangerous play to watch, because they're seeing a Black man out there with a white woman and it looks like he's manhandling her. It's offensive and scary, and all of their fears were brought up. The play wasn't intended for a man of color to play it. So then you flash forward, what I feel was never adjusted was we began to become accustomed to seeing actors of color in the role, but there was never any thought about what's it like for audiences of color watching that play. And I think we haven't really fully thought about our audiences and why we put on plays, and like in terms of what are we trying to do for our society with these plays. Classical plays, you know, modern plays can be more specific about that, but the rehashing of these classical plays, like, what are we trying to say about our audience, our society right now with this? How can we be more inclusive of their stories in this? How can we find, because these stories are universal, so it has the capacity to hold many cultures that just, I mean, Shakespeare himself was already imagining the idea of a society. He wasn't literally talking about Rome. He didn't know Rome. He wasn't literally talking about a Moor. He had a vague idea of what a Moor was. He was really talking about the human condition. So that's why I feel like you can do these plays in so many different ways, and it can be sustained. I would love to see more bravery, more risk into exploring what that means. And how can we be more inclusive? How can we have more of those discussions and figure that out a little bit more, so that people don't feel excluded from the story, from the world, from the process if they're involved in it. And I think that's been ripped wide open, and that's kind of the frontier that we're at. And I'm excited to see, as we start to come back, how theaters approach this, because I don't think it's going to be enough anymore to just do a Shakespeare play. Mm-hmm. Even in the teaching that I've done, I've had a lot of questions as to why even teach this, and why you as a Black man, why are you teaching this? And I've had to really question. For me, again, it's the language. We walk in this world of English, and this language has the ability to create the reality as we perceive it, to include and exclude, and so to know the structure of what's being used, what we're all accepting, and to know how to work with it and change it, gives you more power, more discernment. But to not have access to that leaves you sort of prey to it. So I think there is value, while we continue to participate in this language, to understand it. I think one of the highest forms and uses and manipulation of it is Shakespeare. But I think it's plastic. It can hold, seeing a female in a male role. I had the great pleasure of being in a King Lear with Glenda Jackson playing Lear, and there were aspects, and I've been in previous productions of Lear as well too. So it was amazing, just the little bits of new understandings that I would hear in the language that were absolutely Lear, but I'd never heard in another performance. So, Stratford in Ontario, and was about to do a production of Hamlet with a Black female playing Hamlet. I was like, oh my God, that would be mind blowing. What, and then the pandemic happened and everything got shut down. So, my hopes are that they will pick that up and end up doing that production, because it's just so fascinating to see what new kernels, what new insight can be brought that is in the language. Right. It's all there. It has multiple meanings, and there's lots yet to be explored. Mm. So myself, what part do I see in it? I would love to be a part of it. Certainly, I certainly hope that in rehearsals that I have ahead and opportunities that I have ahead, that I have more foresight. It's easy to sit and have a conversation now, but in the moments, more foresight to ask those questions and to keep digging and help knock the doors open, so that each rehearsal space has the potential for doing more. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's absolutely wonderful, and eloquently put. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for answering all of these questions and giving them your thought. I really, really appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome.